Good evening, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. My name is Safina Chisik-Singh. I'm a first year studying government and astrophysics at the college, and I'm a member of the JFK Jr. Forum Committee. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located on both the park side and JFK Street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. And join me in welcoming Harvard College undergraduate Landon Elks.
Good evening. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. My name is Landon Elks, and I'm a sophomore at Harvard College studying economics and history, and I'm also a member of the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum Committee. This evening, we're here to engage in a crucial conversation about the ongoing conflict between Israel and the Palestinian territories, a struggle that shaped the region for decades, and have an impact to politics, identity, and human lives around the globe. With the recent destruction of Gaza and its profound aftermath, questions of justice, security, and belonging are more urgent than ever. It's my honor to introduce our guest tonight, Peter Beinart, professor of journalism and political science at the City University of New York. He joins us to share his perspective on the conflict and to reflect on themes from his recently published book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza. Tonight's discussion will be moderated by Mathias Risse, director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy, and the Berthold Beitz professor in Human Rights, Global Affairs, and Philosophy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Now, please join me in welcoming our distinguished speakers tonight.
Thank you, and good evening. This Freudian lapse about the Carr Center is actually quite interesting. Our founder, Greg Carr, would probably not mind being run together with Jimmy Carter, since they're both known as human rights people. So let's move right in. So Israel-Palestine is the world's most visible human rights conflict. The war in Gaza, which has cost way upwards of 50,000 lives, has been a moment of generational political awakening for millions of younger people and raised profound questions of political solidarity across generations and ethnicities. The United States is home to the second largest Jewish community in the world, trailing Israel only by about 1 million. Like other Ivy Leagues, Harvard used to have a fraught relationship with Jewish applicants for a long time, and some argue that there continue to be issues. But today our campus benefits greatly from the contributions of a very diverse Jewish community. For the Jewish community, intense questions arise about what Israel is to them and how they see the October 7, 2023 attacks as part of a conflict that has gone on for generations with no end in sight. Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, and their allies face the same question, really. Many on the left ponder the extent to which this conflict is an expression of colonialism. To many religious people, the place they call the Holy Land offers a metaphysical grounding. Questions of Jewish identity are front and center to all of this. They are central to what kind of political solution Jews would favor for this conflict, a one-state or two-state solution, and how to think in detail of either. Questions of Jewish identity are also central to what political influence American Jews will want to exercise on American politics in the future. Questions of Jewish identity, therefore, also essential to the realizability of the human rights of Palestinians. Hardly anyone has thought as intensely about questions of Jewish identity as Peter Beinart, editor-at-large of Jewish Currents, author of Beinart Notebooks and Subtrack, among other things, overall a well-known commentator on American foreign policy in general and Israel-Palestine in particular. His most recent book, which came out this year, is Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning. Peter, by way of just starting to address this audience, can you tell us a little bit about obviously the title says what the book is about, why you wrote it, what the main message of the book is?
Sure. Thank you for having me. Really nice to be here. Obviously, on this subject, I'm always very aware that people have very deeply held, passionate feelings, and I always kind of look out at the audience and kind of hope that there are people in the audience who really strongly disagree with me, because my worry is always that in these kind of conversations, like so many others, people only tend to go to listen to those with whom they agree, and I really, really admire people who actually go out of their way to listen to different points of view. It says, one of my favorite lines from the Talmud is from an area, a portion of the Talmud called Pirkei Avot, where it says, who is wise? The one who learns from all people. So I always feel like the person who's traveling the furthest ideological distance is kind of showing the greatest degree of wisdom in any particular room. I wrote this book because after the horror of October 7th, the massacres of October 7th and the abductions of October 7th, I then saw Israel beginning to really destroy the Gaza Strip. I mean, most of the hospitals are destroyed, most of the universities, most of the schools, most of the buildings, most of the bakeries, most of the agriculture. The things that are required for people to live are all being destroyed. And I kind of looked around at the Jewish communities in which I live that really structure my life, that are crucial to my life. And I saw this very beautiful and intense feeling of solidarity and empathy for Israeli Jewish suffering. And so we immediately started praying for the hostages, that the stories of individual hostages and their families were repeated again and again. I came to know the stories of these individuals and of the communities, these kibbutzim near Gaza, and it was very, very beautiful and very moving. But in some ways, precisely because it was so beautiful and so moving and so touching, it made the absence of any conversation about Palestinian death all the more glaring. I mean, very frequently I was in spaces where there was no acknowledgement that Palestinians were dying at all. And when there was an acknowledgement, oftentimes it was kind of minimized, just to say, well, the numbers that we're getting from the Hamas health ministry are probably wrong. It's probably really not nearly as many people dying as they say, which is, I took as a way of saying, not really something you really need to worry about very much. In fact, we now find from a series of academic studies in the Lancet, actually, that the numbers were wrong. They were way too low, which wasn't that hard to figure out, given that they were only reporting from hospital morgues. You didn't have to be a rocket scientist to see that a lot of people in Gaza who were being killed were not going to make it to a hospital morgue. They were dead under the rubble or dying of malnutrition or disease or lack of medical care in their homes. And then when there was an acknowledgement, oftentimes the message was kind of, well, it's unfortunate, but, really the Palestinians brought this on themselves, right? They're using their population as human shields, so essentially they're killing themselves. Never once was I in a Jewish space where there was the name of a Palestinian who was killed in Gaza uttered, whether there was the story of this person, anything done to really humanize these people. And I began to think, this is a strange expression of Judaism. Because to me, what makes Judaism fascinating, one of the things that makes it so fascinating, I think in some way indifferent from Christianity, Islam, is the really fascinating tension in Judaism between the universal and the particular, right? The Torah does not start with Jews. The first people that we encounter in Torah, in the book of Genesis, Adam, Eve, Noah, the entire generation of the flood, the Tower of Babel, these are not Jews. The Jewish story doesn't start a ways into the book of Genesis with Abraham and then Isaac and Jacob. So there's a sense that all human beings are created in the image of God, which is absolutely central, right? The Talmud says that the reason that we have one person is created, Adam, is so nobody can say that my father is greater than your father, which is simply to say as if we are a different species than you. So, and then of course, but in Judaism, there's also this notion of Jews as a family, right? This family that's described in Genesis that becomes a nation in Exodus, Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel. But I felt like this tension had been completely lost, right? And what I was seeing, because the universal message, the sense that the dignity of all human beings is precious, right, had been erased. And essentially, I felt like Judaism was being reformed in front of me as a purely tribal creed. Essentially, it's like we care intensely about our own, and for the Palestinians, it's as if at best it's an unfortunate necessity, right? But these people are never actually being confronted as human beings. And I was struck about this experience because I was not surrounded by people who, generally I think of as not thoughtful and empathetic and kind people, actually Part of the reason I'm in these spaces is because the people in these spaces are, I think, so intellectually curious and empathetic and thoughtful and about the way they live their lives. But I felt like on this subject, it was like a wall was going up that was separating them from their best selves. And I wanted to try to understand what that was. It felt to me like a certain story, a very dominant story that existed in many Jewish spaces that had the effect of creating this situation where we could watch this horror. I mean, one of the greatest destructions of a society in modern history. There are more child amputees in Gaza, which is a very small place, than anywhere else in the world, right? And what is it about this story that is so powerful that it allows people to not see these things? When they're not hidden, they're very easy to see if you just turn on the internet, right? And I began to feel like it was because there was this story of being Jewish that was a story of eternal victimhood. That the role of Jews vis-a-vis the rest of the world is to always be in the role of the kind of virtuous victim. And so immediately I noticed that the rhetorical tropes after October 7th were, first of all, that this was a pogrom, right? So as if it's to say the violence against Jews in 2023 is essentially the same as the violence in like Kishinev in the Russian Empire in 1903. And then the second thing was that it was the largest killing of Jews since the Holocaust. As if to say this violence against Jews is in some fundamental way like the Holocaust. And then you even had biblical references, like they are like Amalek, right? This genocidal kind of tribe from the book of Exodus. And to me, it felt like a story was being told about Jews which took secular history and sacred texts, and instead of recognizing that Jews have the full range of human capacities, can be victims and victimizers in different circumstances, just like anybody else. And that having been a victim in one time and place doesn't mean you are inoculated from being a victimizer in another time and place, that Jews are kind of locked into this one role that is kind of endlessly repeating, which means that Palestinians, Hamas, whatever, is just the reincarnation of the evil that emerges in every, as it says in the Passover Haggadah, in every generation an enemy arises, which completely dehumanizes Palestinians, right? Prevents them from actually having their own story, and also completely blinds you to some fundamental truths about Israel and Palestine, which make the violence, I don't see this to justify the violence of October 7th in any way. I'm fundamentally opposed to any violence that targets civilians, right? But the violence against Jews in Nazi Germany or in the Russian Empire was deeply connected to the fact that Jews were legally subjugated, that Jews were legal inferiors, right? The violence that's taking place on October 7th is connected to the fact that Jews are legal superiors, that Jews have legal supremacy over Palestinians, right? And so this violence takes place in this context of Palestinian legal inferiority, right? And so I began to imagine that I thought that if we could look at different aspects of Jewish sacred texts, and we could think about things like the Purim story, the book of Esther, and see it not only as a story of attempted genocide of Jews, but also remember that in the 9th chapter of the book of Esther, it ends with a massacre by Jews. We could see that our own tradition gives us a much broader range of models of what it means to be Jewish. Some of that actually would be very valuable warnings for a condition in which Jews have legal supremacy. And that if we could move beyond these metaphors of pogroms and Holocaust, we could see that actually a better metaphor for what happened on October 7th would be something like what happened in the United States in the 19th century time and time again, which was that people were forced off of their lands and herded into smaller and smaller territories. And when they had the opportunity, they often broke out of those territories and massacred men, women, and children in the American Midwest and West. And you can't understand anything, it seems to me, about Gaza without first understanding that the people in Gaza are not from Gaza. They're the descendants of people who were forcibly expelled from their land in what's now Israel. Many of them are so close to the lands from which they were expelled that they can actually see those lands as they live in what Human Rights Watch calls an open-air prison, which the United Nations said was unlivable for human beings even before October 7th. And they can see that there's much less populated, much more kind of verdant land right across the barbed wire fence that their families used to live on, right? Now, that doesn't, again, justify anything that Hamas did when it targeted civilians, but it's a crucial context to understanding why this happened. And if you don't understand that there is a context and a system of oppression, then the default story just becomes, well, we are victims and they're barbarians, and so the response to this violence must be even more massive violence. And that was the story that most Americans told about Native Americans in the 19th century when they committed acts of violence, which then became the predicate for even more massive violence, which ultimately led to the destruction of Native Americans on this continent, right? And so now we've gotten all the way to the point where the Israeli government is saying that it wants mass expulsion of 2 million Palestinians. And I keep looking at my community, which I love, and I keep thinking, surely this will be too far. This will be the point at which people say enough. And I find to my horror that there is no point at which people say, this is too much. If I had said, and then I'll stop, if I had said before Trump proposed his plan, which was then embraced by not just Benjamin Netanyahu, but Netanyahu's centrist opponents like Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz. If I had said that Israel was going to forcibly want to just expel all the Palestinians, or if I had said that Israel was going to deny all humanitarian aid to Gaza, which they're doing right now, I would have been accused of slandering Israel to the point perhaps of anti-Semitism. But then when Israel actually did those things, the American Jewish organizations didn't say, wow, this is terrible. We said Israel would never do these things because they're beyond the pale. What happens is they came up with a post facto rationalization to explain why this is actually justified and necessary. And this is the relationship that the organized American Jewish community has to Israel, I think because of this story, which is very problematic.
So let's bring it to our campuses, and specifically our campus this year, very campus here, Harvard University.
Has some things been going on here?
Various things have been going on, yeah. So you live in New York, things have been going on there. We had our versions of this. So as you know, this has gone into overdrive here last week, right? So when the Trump government handed down a number of demands and threatened to for this to be implicating about $9 billion in federal funding over time, which basically brings in a substantial part of the whole Massachusetts healthcare system, right? To even come to this formidable number. So much of that, so in a way, this is also questions of Jewish identity are now incredibly important, everywhere, right? I mean, they are incredibly important to basically the global, to important aspects of global peace, right? Because that's about the future of the region, what kind of state we can have there, but it's also about an understanding of anti-Semitism, what anti-Semitism is, how to conceptualize it, and the kind of role it has assumed in American politics right now. So, your view from New York, I mean, I know you are really from here, right? You're born in Cambridge, but so how do you look at what's happening with being the government and Harvard University, and what are you hoping that Harvard University will, specifically Harvard University, will do in response to it?
Yeah. So I guess the way I think about this is that Donald Trump, in order to create an authoritarian regime, wants to kind of domesticate and cripple insignificant institutions that are not under his control. Right? That could be sources of dissent against him. So the independent media, law firms, even parts of the government that are not directly under his control. And universities are a natural target in that regard because they teach people to think critically. They're historically a place of dissent against whoever is in power. Right? So you want to try to domesticate and cripple those institutions. I don't think Trump would mind if you can go through Harvard and major in computer science and go work at Goldman Sachs. But he doesn't want Harvard or Columbia to be institutions that are going to teach people to basically go and protest and cause trouble for him. Right? And so he has a variety of rationales. At UPenn, the rationale was transgender swimmers. Right? But the question to me is, why is Trump interested in using this rationale of anti-Semitism as his pretext for trying to domesticate and cripple these universities, right? Because I think the question that to say that he doesn't have a lot of credibility on the question of anti-Semitism would be an understatement, right? I mean, there's been no modern American president who's come anywhere near saying as many borderline anti-Semitic things as Donald Trump has for many, many, many decades, including in 2016 running the most anti-Semitic ad of any major presidential American candidate in my lifetime, right, where he featured 3 prominent American Jews and basically said they're responsible for basically for destroying the global economy, right? So I think the reason that Trump is doing this is because he knows that it will be hard to rally resistance against it, because prominent Democrats, including Chuck Schumer, as he says very explicitly in his book, have conceded the premise that the movement for Palestinian freedom is saturated with anti-Semitism and that the universities have not cracked down enough. And if you concede that premise, then it's hard to get that angry at Trump when he says, yes, it's so bad that now we need to really play hardball. We need to threaten their funding, right? We need to, if these people are anti-Semites on campus and they don't have citizenship and the universities haven't dealt with them, well, then we're going to deal with them, right? And so the Democrats, many of them are hamstrung in their ability to respond to this because I think they've accepted a premise which is just fundamentally wrong. I think it's fundamentally wrong. And it's based on a definition of anti-Semitism that I think it's, in particular, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, a definition of anti-Semitism, that I think, and I'm sorry for saying this at Harvard, it's shameful that Harvard accepted the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. It's a disgrace. It's really, this definition is, frankly, from a scholarly perspective, a joke. I mean, are there any actual scholars who study anti-Semitism as it relates to Israel-Palestine on this campus who would support the IHRA definition? Did Harvard actually, I mean, it's an academic institution. It's the world's most famous university. Did they consult with their own scholars of this subject? No, because the IHRA definition makes no sense from a scholarly perspective, right? To say that one of the examples of anti-Semitism is to say that Israel is racist, right? When Israel has been declared to be practicing apartheid by its own leading human rights organizations, is nonsensical. What, are you not going to have somebody speak at Harvard from B'Tselem, Israel's most important human rights organization, because they say Israel is racist, right? You're going to be able to have anyone from Haaretz newspaper, which calls Israel racist all the time? Another example is that you can't compare Israel to the Nazis, right? I mean, I'm looking at my friend Yael here. Her father, Zev Sternhell, who won the Israel Prize, one of the world's most eminent scholars of fascism in the world, wrote about things that he saw in Israel that he felt had elements of fascism that reminded him of not of concentration camps, but of things that were happening in German politics in the 1930s. Just like we talk about this all the time in the United States. Why on earth is that prima facie evidence of anti-Semitism, right? This definition is basically, it has the effect of turning anti-Zionism equating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, which then basically makes all Palestinians into bigots, right? Because, like, newsflash, Palestinians are not big fans of Zionism, right? You're going to have a hard time finding Palestinians who aren't anti-Zionists, right? And even if you think Zionism has been great for Jews, it's really hard to argue that it's not been pretty bad for Palestinians, right? Israel's formation starts with an act of mass expulsion of Palestinians in 1948, and it goes downhill from there, from Palestinians, right? So if you endorse a definition of anti-Semitism, which essentially says opposing Jewish supremacy is anti-Semitic, the message you're sending to all of your Palestinian students is you are now going to be classified as bigots, and anyone who supports you is going to be classified as bigots. And it's a pretty straight through line, it seems to me, from there to the fact that I know that there are Palestinian non-citizen students now at Columbia University, maybe at this university, who are in hiding. There are students who are literally hiding on their own campuses, right? And it seems to me when you adopt that definition of anti-Semitism, you have abandoned the moral authority to oppose what Donald Trump is doing because you've accepted a set of premises that actually already profoundly dehumanize Palestinians by turning them into bigots for simply talking about their own experience with the state of Israel and with its ideology of Zionism. And so that really upsets me. I spoke last night at the Divinity School at a program that's being shut down because of the pressure that's come under this. And, and I'll just say one more thing. People say, well, these programs like the one at the Divinity School or the one at Public Health are biased because they don't show both sides, right? But that's not the way that in a scholarly institution you're actually supposed to think about academic inquiry, right? I mean, the motto is veritas. The motto is truth. So you have a scholarly methodology to think about what scholars think is the truth of something, right? You don't say vis-a-vis India's treatment of Muslims or Russia's relationship with Ukraine or Burma's relationship with Rohingya and say, well, let's make sure we're representing both sides. You say, what is a scholarly methodology that tries to bring us to an understanding of truth in this situation, right? And then you have people who are just doing that now being shut down because of this political pressure that Harvard University seems unwilling to stand up against.
So let me actually want to come back to this point. What concretely you think Harvard should be doing at this stage? I just want to say one thing about what you said about Harvard adopting this definition of anti-Semitism. So it's actually not quite like that. So what happened was, the federal government under the first Trump administration adopted that the Holocaust Remembrance Association definition of anti-Semitism for civil rights purposes. Right. Biden never rescinded it, so Biden stuck with it. Right. So Trump too still has it. And what Harvard basically did, what was reported, a few weeks ago, was Harvard adopted this understanding of anti-Semitism, by which we are bound anyway in our dealings with the federal government, into its definition of bullying. And that is actually important to understand, because what that means is nobody's going to be in trouble, for acting anti-Semitically by that definition just in isolation, right? It would only kick in, it would create a problem if it comes as part of a bullying accusation, right? And which comes with other conditions that would basically be the dominant factors, the bullying activity, right? I completely agree with you in terms of what anti-Semitism, but it's really not the case that Harvard has endorsed that understanding of anti-Semitism per se.
Right. No, I take your point, and I appreciate that modification. I would just say that in these circumstances, I worry about how even this discussion of bullying will play itself out, right? Because it seems to me that you have a context in which the distinction, in which I think very purposely by American politicians and establishment Jewish organizations and donors, the distinction between what makes someone unsafe and what makes someone uncomfortable has been, when it comes to Jewish students, has been very, very purposely eroded, right? So I think I know, and as you know, that there are many, many Jewish students who come from very strongly Zionist homes and who find some of the discourse that they experience on campus about Israel extremely discomforting, that it's very, very hard, and I hear this from Jewish students all the time, that to come to a campus and find that to be considered a Zionist makes you very, very unpopular, right? Is a really, really hard thing, right? When this is an intimate, precious term for you that you grew up with, right? But it seems to me that it's really important to hold, in some ways the experience that Jewish students are having, if they're pro-Israel, is now becoming a little bit like what it's like to be anti-abortion on a college campus, right? It's not easy, right? You're likely to have strong resistance, and you're going to be in a minority politically, which is not easy, right? But I just think it's really important to, and so then, but that then, it seems to me, the response to that is, for a university, should be a process of education, right? Of curating environments where people can interrogate what do terms like Zionism mean, and they can learn things that they didn't learn at home, right? And they have the opportunity to express their views in dialogue with other students. But I think when the discourse becomes the discourse of safety, right, because someone is chanting, Palestine will be free from the river to the sea, then I think what actually happens is you can get into these situations where you have a lot of students being expelled and suspended and even jailed for basically just expressing speech that bothers other students.
So as you might know, the Harvard Corporation and the Board of Overseers, so our governance bodies just met this weekend to think about strategy, and I have no idea what they came up with, but if they called you in, if Alan Garber called you in and said, Peter, what would you advise we should do right now in response to this demand letter, what would you advise?
I mean, look, maybe this is simple-minded, and maybe this is why I don't get to be the president of Harvard University, but I guess the way I would think about it is, listen, Donald Trump is more powerful than you, right? So he may ultimately get what he wants, right? It's not clear that a strategy of appeasement is going to work with this guy, right? I mean, he's not the kind of guy who necessarily, like many bullies, when he's appeased, it actually just makes him want to bully you more. It may be that standing up to him won't work either because he's too powerful. Maybe if you get together with all of the other universities and you collectively sue and you collectively stand together, you can have more relative power. So I don't know which strategy is more likely to win. It may be that both strategies would lose, but then at least lose with dignity. I mean, if you're going to have money being taken away, at least go down and maintain your self-respect. You have a set of principles that you believe in about academic freedom, about the way a university is supposed to be run and operated, about what kind of institution it is, right? And so don't get yourself in the situation like the former president of Columbia, where you disgrace yourself in front of a congressional committee by throwing your own faculty under the bus, and then basically you end up being forced to resign anyway, and you have your money taken away anyway. At least be able to do in a situation where when you talk about what happened one day to your grandchildren, you can say, I maintained my self-respect. I stood up for principles I believe in.
It's actually, it is hard to, it's hard to over describe how much is at stake right now, right? So there has been a certain social compact between the government and universities at a level that was established during the Second World War, right, where universities kind of got involved in the business of the government, which at the time was very much war-directed, but also coming out of the New Deal, where universities were substantially at a much higher level integrated into the functioning of the country than before. And that compact, that understanding of a university, working with government on a lot of things, especially in the medical domain and in the science domain, technology domain, we have maintained that, right? It's a very high-level compact between government and universities, and this is basically now being, to put it gently, reconsidered, right? So we are up for something. But let's move back to the Israel-Palestine scenario, just to kind of get your views on that a little bit more in focus. And let me track I don't do this very often, but let me track a Netanyahu voter.
Please.
So if I'm a Netanyahu voter, I would sit here and be a bit in disbelief. I would say to you, look, this is in Gaza. There's this organization, Hamas, that is committed to eradicating us, right? So if they got their will, they would kill us all, and they have, put this in evidence on October 7th. Yeah? And so what the prime minister now is doing is he's going to make sure that this will never happen again. That we are actually, that was the point of Zionism, that we are actually safe in a home, right? Yeah. And so what it takes to keep us safe is to eradicate Hamas in Gaza. And if the only way of doing that is to drive everybody else out, that would be terrible, but it is the safety concern that we need to pursue. What is this person getting wrong?
Yes.
And what are you suggesting instead?
Yeah, thank you. I think, well, the first thing I would say to that person is that Israel has now been attacking Gaza for a year and a half, right? As I said, it's destroyed most of the civilian infrastructure in the place. But Hamas is still there, right? So how well has this worked, right? Hamas is still there. It's true, a lot of Hamas fighters have been killed. But we know that Hamas recruits fighters from the families of people Israel has killed. So even though Hamas has lost a lot of fighters, they also have the greatest recruitment bonanza in their history, right? And we know that when you kill lots and lots of people, you produce people who are going to want to fight you for a very, very long time, right? The guy who now runs Islamic Jihad, which is Hamas's smaller kind of the smaller kind of Islamist group that also participated in October 7th. He was 3 years old when Israel went into Gaza in 1956, right, and massacred about 100 Palestinians. And he's now 70, and he's still fighting against Israel, right? So from a security perspective, how good a bet does that look for you, right? It's true Israel has destroyed a lot of Hamas's weaponry, but according to people I know from Gaza who I've talked to about this, Hamas is now getting its new weaponry is basically coming from reconstituting the bombs that Israel and ordinances that Israel has dropped in Gaza, because this is what the Viet Cong did with the United States. There's so much weaponry now in Gaza that Hamas is taking it and repurposing it, right? So just from a strategic kind of point of view, how well is this working? And let's say you could snap your fingers and Hamas would not exist, right? Why do you think that Palestinians would not create new institutions to fight against you if they are being denied basic freedoms, right? I mean, one of the reasons that is, it's not like Israel didn't have a problem with Palestinians before Hamas was created in 1987. In fact, one of the reasons that Israel was sympathetic to Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, which became Hamas in the late 1980s, was they couldn't imagine any Palestinian group more frightening than the PLO, than Fatah, the nationalist organization, and the leftist Palestinian groups like the PFLP, because they had been ones doing the armed attacks in the 1970s and 80s. right? And so this is not fundamental. I mean, I have lots of problems with Hamas. I don't believe in Islamism. I don't believe in states that have a Muslim based on Muslim supremacy or Hindu or Christian or Jewish supremacy. I fundamentally loathe attacks on civilians, which Hamas did long before October 7th, unfortunately. But the fundamental reality is that Palestinians are going to fight against their oppression, right? And it seems to me where Israel has some influence is the question of how Palestinians do this, right? Because Palestinians have tried every different tactic, right? They've done general strikes, and they've done boycotts, and they've done letter-writing campaigns, and they've gone to the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice and the UN, and they've done resistance against soldiers, and they've done resistance, unfortunately, against civilians, right? And so to me, if I'm thinking about how to weaken not just Hamas, but any Palestinian group that's going to take Israeli life, it seems to me what I want to do is send a message to Palestinians that ethical forms of resistance that abide by international law and do not take civilian life, I want to show Palestinians that those have a chance of success. Right? My friend Mohammed Shahada, who I quote in my book, has told me repeatedly about conversations that he had with people who were in Hamas when he was growing up. Mohammed opposes violence against civilians. And he's told me that people would say to him, Mohammed, how well have your efforts worked? They've gotten us nothing. Right? When Palestinians marched largely nonviolently in 2018 in the Great March of Return, it wasn't like Israel and the American Jewish organizations, the American government said, gosh, you're acting nonviolently. Good for you. We always said we needed Palestinian Gandhis. Right. No, what did Israel do? It put sharpshooters on that barbed wire fence and shot thousands and thousands and thousands of people. Many of them, their limbs had to be amputated. When Palestinians try boycotts and other nonviolent efforts, the response by the U.S. government is to try to criminalize these efforts by saying in many states you can't work for state government unless you promise not to boycott Israel. When they go to the International Criminal Court, the U.S. imposes sanctions on the International Criminal Court. So the message you're sending to Palestinians is essentially that your resistance is going to be treated the same way, right? Whether it's in conformity with international law and nonviolent, or whether it's an attack on civilians. So it seems to me, if you want to make Israelis safer, then actually show Palestinians that resistance that doesn't kill Israelis works. And I think then you actually change the Palestinian political climate in a way that makes Israelis safer.
I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm turning this over to the audience. And those of you who are forum regulars know there's a mic over there, mic over there, mic over there, mic over there. So formulate your questions, line up there, and I will be going around the mics then after I'm done with my next and last question. So let me channel another opposing view to what you have been argued, and that's from a different corner. This is Ken Roth, who was former executive director of Human Rights Watch, was here last week, not here, but in town. And this is about what the future might hold. So Ken thinks the most likely scenario is that we're going back to some version, probably worse version of October 6th. So what we had before. But if there's hope for something better, it would be a two-state solution, because that is something that the international context there, also support from Saudi Arabia, other powerful, wealthy countries would most readily support. And it's also something that President Trump could be won over for in terms of, because the powerful countries in the region would support it. And if Trump puts his weight behind it, then the Israeli government could be persuaded, but could be pushed to do the same. So he thinks among the alternatives to October 6th, basically a two-state solution is the most realistic version, and I think that's a relatively common view. One-state solutions are typically not defended by people in your part of the political spectrum, right? So one-state solution, we normally hear a kind of Jewish unitary state, but you want a one-state, and you think a one-state is the only realistic solution here. But you want this to be an Israel that is not a Jewish state, but one that is emancipating both Palestinians and Jews. What do you say back to Ken Roth, who thinks that is just hopelessly unrealistic?
Right. Look, I think at this moment in history, both two states, a sovereign Palestinian state and one equal binational state, are both completely unrealistic. I mean, what's realistic is is what I would say a kind of the continuation of a slow process of the destruction of the Palestinian people, through a process of ethnic cleansing, which is also happening in the West Bank in significant measure, and in Gaza. And so I think the kind of moral imperative, it seems to me, today, regardless of which of those outcomes one ultimately wants, is to try to end the Israeli impunity that allows Israel to continue to move forward in doing this, right? So I will say something about one state, but I think whether one supports, as I do, one equal state or whether one supports two states, it seems to me you're never going to have any hope of getting there, right, as long as Israel can continue to do what it's doing now with impunity. I mean, it's amazing when you think about it that Netanyahu was indicted by the International Criminal Court for basically a policy of starvation, right, for denying humanitarian aid into Gaza. And yet the man feels so much impunity that they can deny all humanitarian into Gaza since, I think, early March, right, which just shows basically the degree to which they are completely insulated from facing the consequences of their actions, right? If Israel did not have an endless supply of US weapons to do what it's doing in Gaza, then Israeli political leaders would have to think differently, right? And this is not unique to Israel. People who become accustomed to legal supremacy, whether it's in South Africa under apartheid or in Northern Ireland or in the United States during segregation, that is always their plan A. That is what they would like to continue to do. People rarely wake up one morning and think, oh my gosh, this isn't good. We should do something fundamentally different. In fact, what happens is that people who become accustomed to legal supremacy tend to equate equality with death, or at least with their own subjugation. I mean, I know, because I spent part of my childhood in apartheid South Africa, is that overwhelmingly white South Africans believe that if there was one person, one vote, and blacks could form a government, their lives would be in mortal danger, right? The Protestant leader Ian Paisley said that the Good Friday Accord, which gave Catholics political equality, was a prelude to genocide, right? So it's only when there is resistance and an end to impunity, and you can't continue to do what you're doing, that people will then start to think about alternatives, right? Whether that alternative is two states or one equal state. The reason that I support one equal state, one equal binational state, is I think it's more just than partition. I think it's more just for two reasons. In partition, as generally understood, you have to maintain a Jewish demographic majority, right? It's just within a smaller border, right? I don't believe in this language of demographic majorities, which in America is the language of Tucker Carlson, right, is not a language that I'm comfortable with, right? The message it sends to Palestinian citizens, who are 20% of the population, is that every time a Palestinian child is born, you're a demographic threat to the state, because God forbid that your numbers could go from 20% to 25% to 30%, right? That's not being an equal citizen when your state views you that way because you happen to be of the wrong ethno-religious group. And secondly, because of this demographic need, you can't allow Palestinians to return to the places from which they're expelled, right? Palestinians can't return to Jaffa or Haifa or Safed or Lida or whatever, because then there'd be too many Palestinians around, right? And I just have not yet to hear a convincing ethical argument for why a Jew should be, like me, should be able to return to Israel after 2,000 years, but a Palestinian who was expelled 75 years ago shouldn't be able to go back, right? So to me, that's the moral position that I believe in. Now, that said, if the Palestinian national movement came to the conclusion that that is not possible, right, and they would prefer to accept a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, 22% of mandatory Palestine, then it's certainly not my place to be more Catholic than the Pope, right? If that's their position, right, and then there's a deal that's made, and in a legitimate process, Palestinians support it, then that's fine. It would be much better than where we are today. Part of the problem is we don't have a functional, legitimate Palestinian leadership today. The PLO, which was this umbrella of the different Palestinian factions, doesn't really operate anymore. So we really don't know what Palestinians want. We don't know in what way they want to vindicate their rights. There was a historic decision in 1988 by the PLO to accept partition. Many Palestinian intellectuals today think that's a dead letter, right, that it's not possible anymore, and so Palestinians should instead support the idea of one equal state. But I think one of the things that's really imperative is that Palestinians have the opportunity to choose their own leaders in a legitimate way, so that Palestinians themselves can say, this is the form in which we want our freedom to take.
Okay, I will go to questions from the audience now. Remember, there's again four mics there. I'm going to go to you guys first. And remember the usual rules of engagement in the forum. Please introduce yourself. Please keep it relatively short, and please make it an actual question. So starting up there with the gentleman in the sweater.
Thank you very much, Professor Risse, and hello, and thank you again. My name is Omri. I'm the MCMPA student here. I'm originally from Israel, a son of two Arab Jews parents that was descended from Morocco and Egypt. And the reason that I'm mentioning that is I think talking about the two-state solution here in Boston, here in America, or outside of any context of the region is just counterproductive. Both Israelis and both Palestinians mentioned multiple times in the past that they don't care about the two-state solution, and trying to impose that solution on people who don't really want it, even after October 7th, is just imposing something. So I want to offer to you something, and then maybe something else to also to concentrate their energy in. So I offer two one-state solution. It couldn't be one big nation, or talking about majorities or not. And you referring as Israeli Arabs as Palestinians is just wrong in general to say about there's 2 million Palestinians lives in Israel. It's just not true.
Why?
Disconnected from reality.
Sorry, why are they Palestinians?
They're Palestinians. I am Palestinian, as Arab Jew. And I'm not. I'm Israeli exactly like them. And my kids go to school taught by Arab teachers. They're equally right to me and where I live in the heart of Israel. That's one thing for you. The second thing, I think, part of your book and part of your energy should be much more oriented towards creating a sustainable and tangible Palestinian leadership. It's not about partition. It's about, you mentioned 75 years, it's actually 77. And I really urge Palestinians to emerge leadership, maybe for the 80th anniversary that's coming in 2 years, in November of 2027, to really emerge with leadership that will take responsibility on their own people, and not about 100% of the time talk about Israel, which is a sovereign, legitimate state. We don't need any more confirmations from the international arena. What we do need is to follow international law again, specifically on how to form a state. You need an international recognition, right? You need people who want to live in this country, and of course, geographical continuity that would not happen right now in the region because of Gaza and the West Bank. So let's emerge about Palestinian leadership and start bashing Israel for everything that is problematic in the region, and maybe try to talk more about Palestinian leadership building instead of just bashing Israel. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for coming. I appreciate it. I know we have different views, and I am very grateful for you for coming. As it happens, my grandmother was born in Egypt, so we have that in common. But I do disagree with you about Arab Israelis. They are simply the Palestinians who managed to not get expelled in 1948. Right? They didn't become a separate group of people, right? They're Arabic-speaking like Palestinians, right? And they are people who were in Mandatory Palestine who developed that Palestinian national identity as people did in Mandatory Palestine. It's just that some people, after 1948, ended up on one side of a border and the other people ended up on the other side of the border, right? And I think that this term Arab Israelis has the tendency to kind of mask the fact that there is actually a Palestinian people. It's just been fragmented over history by Israeli policies. And so I agree with you that that Palestinians should be able to choose their own leadership, right? But Palestinians have to be able to have a legitimate process for choosing that leadership, right? So we know that many of the most popular Palestinian leaders, like Marwan Barghouti, for instance, are actually in Israeli jails, right? So if you want to be able to have legitimate Palestinian leadership, right? Maybe actually you should allow some of those people out of jail, right? Or you should allow elections in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, something that Israel has generally been opposed to doing. Israel certainly has not allowed Palestinians in East Jerusalem to vote. So Palestinians may not choose the leaders that you would want, right? Just as Israel doesn't choose the leaders that I think Palestinians would want, right? But the point is that Palestinians need to be able to deserve to choose their own leadership, right? In order to have a legitimate voice. As to the question of whether Palestinians are ready for a state or something like this, to be honest, that's to me a colonial attitude, right? I mean, that human beings are all created equal in the image of God. And to me, the political corollary of that theological principle is that human beings should be treated equally under the law, right? So it's not that Palestinians have to earn the right to have legal equality, right? Either in their own state or in a state alongside Jews. That is a right that they have as human beings, right? And so I think that's where I think our assumptions differ.
Let's go to that mic over here.
Hello, thank you so much for speaking with us today. I wanted to ask about your recent article on Chuck
Can you
Schumer.
introduce yourself also as per the rules?
Okay, my name is Shireen, and I'm a law and Masters of Public Policy student. Your recent article on Chuck Schumer's complicity in Trump's attacks on academic freedom and on civil rights, especially on college campuses. And you discussed how the Democratic Party does not discuss the rise of anti-Semitism in the 21st century with the rise of the Christian right and with other forms of bigotry and racism. So if not for the Democratic leadership, who do you see as the real opposition, policymakers or otherwise, to Trump's weaponization of anti-Semitism to limit civil rights?
Thanks. I think that the Democratic Party has been in this, there's been this fundamental incoherence in the Democratic Party. Because when it comes to the United States, people like Kamala Harris and others say that they believe very strongly in the idea of equality under the law, and they oppose white Christian supremacy. They oppose ethno-nationalism, right? And yet those same politicians actually support those very principles of Jewish supremacy, legal supremacy, of ethno-nationalism in Israel and Palestine, right? And I think in some ways what we saw in the campaign, because of the salience, because of this subject, because of Israel's destruction of Gaza, was the conflict between those two principles, in which people were saying in various ways, how can Kamala Harris say she believes in these principles in the United States when she is so fundamentally opposed to these principles when it comes to Palestinians? And so I think that my hope would be that you will see new politicians emerge in the Democratic Party who actually, I'm not asking them to have any different view vis-a-vis Palestine and Israel than they would about any other place, right? I would like them to believe in the same principles when it comes to Narendra Modi's efforts at Hindu supremacy, or Jair Bolsonaro, or Viktor Orban, or the AfD, or any of these authoritarian nationalist movements, or Donald Trump, to say, we oppose these things because we think that all people should be treated equally, irrespective of their race, or ethnicity, or religion, or gender, or sexual orientation. And I think if a politician had the willingness to run on that platform in a Democratic primary for president, I think they would get a lot of support. Because we can see that there's a huge gap now between where Democratic politicians are and where the Democratic Party base is on this subject. And I think it offers a political opportunity for a politician who has the courage to basically run on that platform. And that's my hope that if we're still able to have free elections in this country in 2028, that would be what I hope will happen in the Democratic Party.
Going to that mic over there.
Thank you for coming to speak to us today. My name's Adam Schneider. I'm also a law and public policy joint degree student. As you said before, given one-state solution and two-state solution both seem completely unobtainable right now, what should the United States foreign policy objectives be, foreign policy goals, with regards to Israel and Palestine? You know, in the short term, in the medium term, and then what are the long-term goals that our government should be prioritizing?
Well, I would start, I think, with a law that exists on the books in the United States called the Leahy Law. The Leahy Law says that the United States is not allowed under law to give weapons to elements of foreign militaries that commit gross human rights violations, right? So again, I'm not saying that the United States should treat Israel differently than other countries. I think America should treat Israel the same as other countries, right? We have never implemented the Leahy Law vis-a-vis Israel, right? We don't even gather the data that would be necessary to know whether there are units of the Israeli military that are committing gross human rights violations. But again, given that Amnesty International has said, and Human Rights Watch has said that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, and given that even some of the world's most eminent Holocaust historians, like Omar Bartov, who believe that Israel is committing genocide, I think it's a good likelihood that there are elements of the U.S. military that are Israeli military that are committing gross human rights violations. And so, if the U.S. implemented the Leahy Law, I think that would be a profound shift in American foreign policy, and I think it would be good for the United States not only because I think it would be the United States shouldn't because it would be acting in accordance with human rights, but because one of the problems that America has in its foreign policy is the overwhelming perception by most people around the world of vast, gaping American hypocrisy, right? That the United States likes the International Criminal Court when it acts against Vladimir Putin, right, or against America's adversaries, but when it comes to America and America's allies, right, all of this talk, I know this, we have somebody who's just started at the Kennedy School who used to be the national security advisor who used to talk a lot about the rules-based liberal international order, right? But what I think a lot of people noticed is that actually that all goes by the wayside, right? There's a rules-based international order for America's adversaries, right? But not for America and its allies, right? Which is part of the reason a lot of people in the global South, when they heard America condemning what Russia was doing in Ukraine, rightly condemning, they said, what credibility do you have to talk about rules-based international order, right? So I think it could be the beginning of restoring the credibility of American foreign policy if America was actually willing to apply these principles in a more equal manner.
Thank you.
Good. Going to that mic now.
Hi, my name is Daniela. I'm a Master's in Public Policy candidate here at the Kennedy School. Thank you for being with us today. I've had the opportunity to interview a lot of civilian and military leaders in Israel, and I think part of this mythos and story that you're talking about for me resonates in this line that, like, we have to exist the way that we are because Jews need a safe place to sleep at night. Like that line, I've heard it so many times. I don't think that anything going on right now makes Jews or anybody else safer, but what does the democracy or the government look like, whether it's there or also here, where a lot of Jews are afraid with the way that the Trump administration is using anti-Semitism, like in a positive way, like when you close your eyes and envision the future and the institutions you want to see, what does that safety look like? How do we realize it?
I guess I start from the premise that Jewish safety is intertwined with the safety of people around us, right? And so Jews have been relatively safe in the United States and have become safer as American liberal democracy deepened, right? America became safer when the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were passed, right? And that the Jews around the world have really flourished in liberal democracies that premised on equality under the law, right? And that the irony of the idea that Jews need legal supremacy to be safe is that actually life for Israeli Jews is more dangerous than it is for Jews in any of the large diaspora communities where Jews are small minorities, but where these governments have some fidelity to the principle of equality under the law. And I don't think that's really that complicated why that is, because when you have a system of legal supremacy, you inflict a tremendous amount of violence on the people who are legal inferiors, the people who don't have basic rights, right? Because a state is a very violent entity if you don't have rights. It's only your rights of citizenship, the right to vote, that buffer you against the inherent violence of the state. And when you don't have those rights, the state is a very, very violent institution. But when you inflict all of this violence on one group of people, it creates a context of violence that actually affects everybody, right? It makes you less safe. I mean, imagine what life would be like for white Southerners today in terms of violence if the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act had not been passed, right? And we had another, 50 more, plus 70 years of basically Jim Crow subjugation of blacks. I think life would be more violent for everybody, right? And so that's why in divided societies, as I read political science literature, everybody is safer when everyone has a voice in government. Because when one group is locked out of government, then they're more likely to pick up arms because it's the only way for them to try to get the government to respond to their concerns. And that's the way I believe Jews would be safe. Now, there are some Jews in the United States today that think that Jews can be safe under conditions of kind of white Christian supremacy, right? Who are aligning with Donald Trump, right? And basically saying, well, Trump is, in this particular moment, the Jews are on the side of the victors, the powerful. Trump is really going after non-citizens and immigrants and Hispanics and trans people or whatever, and we're going to be safe. That's not the first group of Jews to make that decision. Again, I mentioned my family is South African. In 1964, at the Rivonia trial, when Mandela was convicted and then sent away for 27 years, all of the white defendants were Jews, and the prosecutor, Percy Uttar, was also a Jew. And there was a debate between Percy Uttar and the defendants in the trial, essentially about what kept Jews safe. Percy Uttar thought that apartheid would keep Jews safe because Jews would be classified as white. And so now, because Trump might talk about Judeo-Christian, that is considered to keep Jews safe. But I think it's false. The truth of the matter is that these forms of bigotry actually travel together. And so the violence and dehumanization and oppression that Trump is visiting on other groups also imperil Jews. And I think the most tangible evidence we have of this is what happened at the Tree of Life synagogue in 2018. Because the man who ultimately went in and committed that act of massacre against Jews didn't start out focusing on Jews. The thing that radicalized him was watching Fox News and other media about the migrant caravan that was invading America from Latin America. And then he decided that there were Jews involved in that.
He targeted a synagogue because it aided an immigrant and refugee.
Because they were having a refugee Shabbat, and because he was a racist, he didn't think that Latin Americans could arrange their own caravans. He thought the Jews were behind it, which ultimately led. So this is the way in which it seems to me it's foolish to think you can make a separate peace with bigots and that their bigotry won't endanger you.
Let us take one more question, then I'm afraid we have to come to a conclusion.
All right, thank you. My name's Randy. I'm a graduate student at the Extension School. When you were on campus last year, you advocated for the one-state solution.
Yes.
You talked about your history in South Africa and how there was a lot of contention. Nobody thought a one-state solution post-apartheid could work, but de Klerk, Nelson Mandela, brought that to fruition. I'm wondering how you answer the challenge in Israel that the circumstances are somewhat different. Not only because there may not be a de Klerk, and there certainly may not be a Mandela on each of the sides, but that there is the issue of the Jewish nature of the state of Israel that butts heads with the call for democracy. And certainly in a one-state solution, those things will likely be in conflict with one another in a way that wasn't so in South Africa. So how do you deal with retaining the Jewishness of the state of Israel and the beauty of democracy in a one-state solution without it just being no longer a Jewish state?
Right. I don't believe that Judaism needs to be part of a state. In fact, if you look at the way that the Judaism is reflected in the state of Israel, it actually doesn't reflect very well on Judaism at all. You have like a very corrupt chief rabbinate of state bureaucrats that impose religious coercion on other people. The beauty of Judaism is that people can practice it freely without the coercion of the state. Right? And just as you see in the United States, in many places, Jews can have vibrant, thriving Jewish communities without having a state be Jewish, right? It doesn't seem to be a state should have any religious identity. A state should be neutral vis-a-vis all of the people who live under its domain and treat them equally, right? And I think Jews can thrive in Jewish communities, speaking Hebrew, observing mitzvot, and living a rich Jewish life under conditions of legal equality. So I think that we need to separate this notion of thriving Jewish culture and community and society from the idea of a state that gives legal supremacy to Jews over Palestinians.
And Saudi Arabia and Qatar and those things that have an Islamic basis, it doesn't influence your idea that maybe there is differentiation in how states are organized?
No, I mean, I'm fundamentally opposed to Muslim states, to Hindu states, to Christian states. I mean, there's a whole separate question about why some of these states in the Gulf are the way they are, right? Rather than liberal democracies that treat everybody equally, right? But one of the reasons that they are the way they are is that the United States wants them to be that way. Right? I mean, the United States has been fundamentally opposed to the idea of genuine democracy in the Middle East, in the Arab world, because we're afraid that these may no longer function as our client states, right, if they were actually to be able to have free elections with legitimate processes. So no, I'm against an Islamic state in Iran. I'm against an Islamic state in Saudi Arabia. I'm against a Hindu state in India. I'm against a white Christian state in the United States. And I'm against the idea of a Jewish supremacist state in Israel.
Let me just say as a concluding thought, a basic assumption of the whole human rights movement is that the best advocacy for protection of rights of any one person or of any one group, in fact, is advocacy for human rights for everyone, right? Because in that sense, we are in this together, that any one person's safety, security, provisions for basics is best taken care of if we want this for everyone. So please join me in thanking Peter Beinart for this conversation. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.